When I was growing up, television occupied a very different place in our lives than it does the current generation, and for good reason. We didn't have as many choices, and we were at the mercy of the television programmers. There just weren't a lot of ways for us to see movies. But when we did see a movie, we tended to see it as a community, because with 3 networks and a few UHF stations, it tended to be very communal what you saw the night before, because there weren't that many options. When you talked to friends, you'd say, "Hey, what did you watch last night?" And there was a good chance you were going to respond, "Well, so did I." Horror fans often had to wait long periods of time to see films that they'd heard about in one of the guidebooks they owned, or maybe they'd read an earlier television listing, which is something I was addicted to. But there was a specific type of film that we had a better chance of having seen and definitely talking to our friends about the next day. And that was the made-for-television horror film. And you'd think that would be a rarity. It seems like a weird bedfellow, right? I mean, the networks were constantly cutting theatrical films to put them on the channel, so why would they make movies for their format? It's not immediately obvious why you do that, but then if you think about it a little bit longer, you realize that they always did really well in ratings with horror movies that they showed as the movies of the week, especially ABC. For some reason, ABC at that time, this is long before they were owned by Disney or any of that, had a real in with a younger audience. And for that reason, horror did very well with them. But of course, they had to cut the movies. And that's problematic. Because if you think about it, the real reason we watched a lot of these films was not just to get scared, although that was a nice benefit if it happened, but it was for all the kind of taboo subjects that horror films would put in front of us. We were younger people, and everything was new and fresh, and we wanted to push all those boundaries, and you could only push so far when the television censors were looking over your shoulder. Television movies then became a way for the networks to have their cake and eat it too, because they wouldn't have to cut anything out of these movies because they made them with an eye towards broadcast. They would walk up to a certain line they knew was acceptable, but not over that line. This sounds like a recipe for really disposable entertainment that modern horror fans wouldn't be very interested in. But the strangest thing happened on the way to our television screens. These movies turned out to inform an entire generation's taste. The big titles are things like Dark Night of the Scarecrow and Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, but even lesser films like Don't Go to Sleep or The Devil's Triangle have huge fan bases and have a lot of memories attached to the early fandom in a lot of horror fans. I mean, I remember when these films were going to air, it was even before they were re-aired in a lot of cases. There was a lot of talk, oh my God, it's going to be back on, make sure you watch it. And then the ritual afterwards was talking about it with your friends. And, hey, that really scared me when this happened. Or, wasn't it crazy when that happened? These were events for the horror community of the day. Much more in many ways than the theatrical films that came out. Because theatrical films, although they were a lot cheaper to go see those films, the opportunities weren't great. There was less theaters out there, and most theaters had 1 or maybe 2 screens. You didn't have the option of seeing everything that was out at any moment. Theaters just weren't built that way, and schedules didn't rotate that way. You had to wait sometimes a month before a film in its first run made it to your town. And even then, the chances of you having an open schedule and the cash, there was a lot of obstacles to you being able to see a theatrical film immediately. But the TV schedule was a different matter. It was much more in your hands. This is even before VCRs, but the truth is, what else were you doing at night after your homework? Television was pretty much the only game in town, unless you were a big reader, which I did a lot of that too, because believe me, there wasn't a horror movie on every night of the week on television. That brings us to the two films I want to cover today. Those films are Fear No Evil and Ritual of Evil. Here, released by Kino Lorber in a really cleaned up, really nice edition where you can buy both films at a single price, and I'll just cut to the chase, you should do that. These movies were intended to be pilots for a television series. That was very common in the day. Produce a television movie, and if it becomes a big hit, then you knew you could produce a series based on that, and it was kind of pre-sold. People knew what it was. The series would have been called Bedeviled, and that'll make more sense in just a second. But this is before the days of Friday the 13th, the series, or Tales from the Dark Side. It wasn't before Twilight Zone, obviously, or Outer Limits, or Night Gallery, but that doesn't mean that this wasn't cutting edge. It absolutely was. There weren't many films made for television that were dealing with the occult in these terms. And it kind of has that feeling you get when you were watching like an old In Search Of episode about Satanism or Stonehenge. It has that weird mysticism to it that was only really saleable in the 1970s. Now, Fear No Evil came out in 1969. I wasn't around, but it played for the entire decade after it with such regularity that I definitely have memories of it. Its sequel, which came out in 1970, wasn't around for that either. Also played almost as much. Not quite as much, but almost as much. And the sequel, Ritual, is the film that I have stronger memories of, and I remember it having been the scarier of the two. But before I get into that, Fear No Evil is the story of a woman whose fiancé brings home a mirror from an antique store. And he dies almost immediately afterwards. She starts seeing him in the mirror, beckoning her to join him. So the mirror is sort of a dimensional passway to the underworld. Maybe. Or maybe she's just gone nuts, which of course, let's face it, in a horror movie, if that's the ending, then we're all going to feel really ripped off. There's some ambiguity to this movie, and it has a very smart narrative that plays it both ways simultaneously, but ultimately this is a haunted mirror story. And this is a very conventional ghost story in most ways. But that said, it also has kind of dated psychedelic effects, and it looks very much like 1969. It does have a weird undercurrent of the times, which is the death of the hippie era. The Manson murders were taking place when this aired. There was a lot in the zeitgeist, I guess, that was uncomfortable, and you can sense it in the film. There's still a lot of the optimism of the early 60s in it, but there's also a dark side running concurrently. Ritual of Evil, which came out the following year, is much more of a murder mystery with an occult background to it. So what we have here is a murder that takes place on a night when a family has a black mass. And the question really isn't whether this really happened or not, although they toy with that. The bigger question really is who's responsible for the death and what really occurred and who should be responsible. There are a few absolutely stunning images that were seared into my skull by this movie. And the key one involves the family dog who, spoilers, doesn't make it through the film, but doesn't stop appearing in the film simply because he dies. On rewatch on this great Kino Lorber release, my position has changed. Whereas I used to think of myself as preferring the sequel to the original, I think Fear No Evil is the better movie overall. It's certainly a lot more exciting, has a lot more going on, and it's tighter as a narrative. It feels like a great traditional haunting story. On the other hand, Ritual of Evil has better characters, better acting, and it's probably better directed, honestly. It's less dated, even though it still is very much dated. I don't know that I want to choose one film over the other, though. I mean, in a very serious sense, both these films hit me exactly in my soft spot. Now, if you're a gore hound and you can't watch a film that doesn't have a lot of the red stuff flowing, these films probably are not going to be your first choice. I don't think you'll be bored by them. You just may be craving more than is on the menu. And that goes back to, remember, this is a television film series. But if you don't mind something with a pace and an atmosphere and a little bit of restraint, I don't think you can go wrong with these movies. If you're a horror fan searching for something that feels a little bit different, something that is a little out of the way and makes you work a little bit, these are the jewels to be mined out of the hills of TV horror.